Hi, everybody. Welcome to our podcast, The Old College Try. I'm Peg Keogh, and I'm joined by our special guest this week, Mark Stucker. Mark is the producer of his amazing podcast, Your College Bound Kid, so definitely look that up. Today, we're talking all about demonstrated interest. In this world where colleges are big businesses and track net revenue, it's important to understand what demonstrated interest is, why it matters, and honestly, why you should even care about it. Stick around. We've got a lot to talk about, and you're going to want to hear it. I keep lying to myself. Everybody, I do not have my partner in crime with me today, Matt Carpenter. I'm giving him a well-deserved break, and I am super excited to have somebody who I consider a friend and a colleague with me today to discuss a topic that it's a word that gets thrown around. For some of you, it might be a new term, or for others, it might be, yeah, I've heard of that, but I'm not really sure where it fits and why it matters. And so I am super excited to have Mark Stucker here today. He has many talents, but the way I first met Mark is because he has this amazing podcast, Your College Bound Kid. So if you Google that, he will come up right away. I'm learning from Mark all things podcasts because he's amazing and he's got this down, and tons of amazing content. So definitely tune into Mark over there. And I've been on his podcast and we just go back and forth, and Matt has as well. So it's super fun. So thanks for joining me. It's so good to have you on the podcast, Mark.
Thank you. My pleasure. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So what we want to talk about today is the concept of demonstrated interest. So Mark, why don't we just start at meta level at the top here? Like, what is it? When I say that, what does that mean in the world of getting into college and going to college?
Absolutely. So, if you were to say to anybody, what are some factors that colleges use when they decide who they're going to admit or not admit? Immediately people would say things like, what are your grades? What are your test scores? What is the level of academic rigor that you've had? Some people might say things like letters of recommendation or extracurriculars, or I said letters of conditions already. So extracurriculars, and then essays. There's another really common one. People will say personal statement, and then individual custom prompts. But there's another big category out there, and it's demonstrated interest. So demonstrated interest is one factor that some colleges use when they're trying to decide who they're going to admit and who they're not going to admit. And at its basic level, it is what are the chances that this student will come? There's some colleges that use this acronym sort of behind closed doors, and it's UTE, and that just stands for unlikely to enroll. So somebody can be spectacular, but if you think there's like slim to no chances they're coming, some schools will pass on that student just for that reason, because at the end of the day, your job is to get the right number of heads and beds. It's enrollment, not necessarily letting an applicant know that they met some proverbial admission standard. And not every college does this, but there's a simple way that you can get a basic sense of who does it by just Googling something called the Common Data Set, which is this incredible wealth of, information that most colleges participate in. And if you go to Section C, which is first year admission data, and go to Section C7, one of the things that's there is demonstrated interest. And colleges are asked to group their perspective on demonstrated interest into 4 categories. They can say not considered, considered, important, or very important. So that's just kind of a basic sense of whether or not, if somebody's using it. However, that doesn't solve all your problems, because people use very confusing definitions. A lot of times you'll hear, especially from more selective schools, they'll say, oh, we don't use demonstrated interest. I was listening to Jim Bach, one of my favorite people in admissions. He's the chief enrollment officer at Swarthmore College. And he was asked in a interview Q&A session by some college counselors, you're not one of these schools that use demonstrated interest, are you? And his response was, of course we use demonstrated interest. We have early decision. So at the basic level, early decision does put a little bit of extra thumb on the scale, in some cases a significant thumb on the scale, because colleges know that you're coming. But some colleges don't like to say they use demonstrated interest because they feel it's a little beneath them, and they think it's only less selective schools that do it. And then there's some very legitimate reasons why they don't like to say they do it, and that's because they're trying to keep their admission officers from getting stalked. Because inevitably, when someone finds out that interest counts more, then they think, okay, well, then maybe I'll send a question by email once a week. Or maybe I'll, instead of doing one visit, I'll show up 3 times. And so they're trying to kind of rein some of that behavior in. So it's quite complicated. And the third reason why it's complicated is people use very different definitions. Some colleges say we don't use demonstrated interest, and by that they mean we don't hire these outside third parties to run an affinity score, which is literally a percentage. Like this student has an 81% chance of coming versus this kid has a 4%, which a lot of colleges actually do that. And they say, well, we don't use that type of sophisticated modeling. And so they think anything other than that means we're not doing demonstrated interest. But the
Yeah.
bottom line is if a college is taking into consideration whether or not they think you're going to come as one factor in whether they'll admit you or not, then they're using demonstrated interest.
Yeah, so you hit a ton of stuff right there. I mean, and you've heard us say this on this podcast before. This is a perfect example. These colleges and universities, most of them are nonprofits, but they are big businesses and it matters to them. Like what Mark just said. He said bodies in the beds, butts on the seats, whatever you want to say, right? They want to fill their class. Some schools it's a lot easier than other schools. But even a Swarthmore or whatever, that early decision, Matt and I have talked about early decision, by applying early decision, you're demonstrating, hey, we are coming here. My child is coming here. I'm coming here as a student. I mean, what's bigger than that as far as demonstrating interest? You're basically saying I'm coming. So they all look at that. They all have so many yeses they're giving out, and they want to get the maximum amount of enrollment checks back. That's basically putting it in layman's terms there. And that UTE, I haven't heard that before. I wrote that down, unlikely to enroll. And I've seen that, Mark. That's really interesting because we had a case couple years ago when I lived in Seattle. A local counselor reached out to me and said, I had this kid. I kind of jadedly call them super kids. They've done everything in the world and the best stats and everything. And the kid did not get into the University of Washington, but got into Harvard. And I said, that's, know this term, but that's a UTE right there, right? UW was like, this kid isn't going to come. Why should we give this kid admission? We'll give it to some other kid that's more likely to pay us some money. So this is what goes on. It's impossible to, you don't want to, we try and relieve stress at CAP. So we're not trying to add to your stress of like, oh my gosh, now I got to understand all this. But today we're going to get in the weeds more on this. Like, what does this mean at these different schools? So that's where I'm going to go with Mark about, and he might even mention maybe Swarthmore's on your kid's list, right? And he's already talked about Swarthmore. So different schools, as always, do things differently, right? Okay. So I'm sure some people, Mark, after listening to you are like, oh, does that mean we have to fly cross country and spend the money to go visit all these schools that are on my kid's list before we even know if they're getting in because they don't have a chance to get in if they're not physically on campus to demonstrate this interest?
Like everything, Peg, in admissions, we like to say it depends, right? Everything. I know sometimes it seems like we're not giving a
And
straight.
financial too, we say
Yeah,
that too.
there you go.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
even
yeah.
like your example of UW, like UW has a 2% admit rate for comp sci, which is lower than Harvard's admit rate. So even in that case, was the kid applying for comp sci, in-state, out-of-state? There's a lot of things there.
Yeah.
But to get to your question, I'm going to go over the no and I'm going to go over the yes because there's a yes and a no answer to this. So the answer is no for most colleges. For most colleges, the evaluation is much more comprehensive, much more sophisticated than just using one metric like did you visit or did you not visit. For most colleges, there are many ways to show DI is a term we oftentimes use you'll hear me use that to show DI. And an in-person visit is not required. And I know later on we'll get more into what are some of those ways. But there is an exception to this. I'm naming names here today, but this is stuff that's been said publicly. So another school not too far from Swarthmore, Haverford College. When I was on the school side, I used to do this at a boarding school. Haverford rep used to make it very clear. If you live within 150 miles of our college and you don't visit, you're not getting in. He was very clear. On a podcast I have, Peg referred to your college bound kid, one of our co-hosts is Andy Strickler. He's the chief enrollment officer at Connecticut College. And Andy will say the same thing. Like, if you live right around the corner from us, you're demonstrating what he calls demonstrated disinterest. because how hard would it have been for you to take 5 or 10 minutes to come by? So you should know that there are some schools that will automatically just, normally they don't deny you because you're kind of playing God if you make this decision off of interest, right? And God forbid you deny somebody and you actually just had a misread. So normally what you'll do is defer in the early round or waitlist in the regular round. And I have to tell a really cool story of something that happened to me 6 years ago with the student I was working with who was at the Petty School in New Jersey. And she really liked the University of Richmond. But Richmond's pretty selective, and so there was no guarantee. So I worked with her, and one of her schools she also liked, but she didn't like it as much, was Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. So she applied to Rhodes, and Rhodes had some pretty sophisticated ways of reading the tea leaves, and they didn't think she was going to come. So they literally put in their response to her, "We are going to waitlist you, not because we're not interested in you, but we don't think you're interested in us. If we have misread the situation, please let us know, and we'll see about changing
Oh,
changing the
wow.
decision." You don't see that type of transparency that often, but
Yeah.
yeah, so a lot of times schools will say, if you're right in our backyard and you can't make it, you're not coming. And and they'll have statistical data that will show that. But for the most part, the answer to that is no. Like, if you're even like, 2.5 hours away, they're not going to assume that you could have made it. You could have been busy. And there's lots and lots of other ways besides a visit to show interest, although a visit is one of the most important ones. When we had Cal Lutheran's chief enrollment officer on our podcast, Matt, he said that students are 5 times more likely to come to Cal Lutheran if they visit versus if they don't visit. So if a college kind of has that knowledge, sort of hard for them not to factor that in at some level.
Yeah, yeah, and I totally get that. I think the takeaway of being a parent of two, if you can drive and not 12-hour drive, it's not a bad thing. And it also helps your child. That's a whole nother conversation, but it helps your child hit a campus and go, "Ooh, I love this. I don't like this." I mean, that's just going to help the process. Kids need to go on campuses in general to get a feel for what colleges they like. I mean, and that can happen way before they're actually, probably should happen way before they're filling out applications. So you kind of said this, so I'm going to jump on it. So I focused on campus visits to start because I figured that's where most people's minds are going. Well, that's like the best way to show it. But what are other ways? And then, yeah, a campus visit, you sign in so they know, okay, you came. But what are other ways that they're going to track it that matter to the college and that families can think about to demonstrate the interest?
Yeah, great question, Peg. And I'm really glad you started with the visits because that's the first thing people think of. If I didn't visit, then I didn't demonstrate interest. It's just not true. So obviously, there's the virtual visit, and the virtual visit has really taken off since COVID. In fact, when you go on most websites now and you go to the admissions tab and then you go to the visit, you have two options, like virtual and in person, just like you're kind of like driving on the road and you come to two ways to go, left or right. So definitely you can do virtual visits. It's not really expected that you do more than a virtual visit if you're coming from a distance. So that's a great way to do it. When you go to a college fair, stop by the table, fill out the inquiry card. If somebody comes to your college, somebody comes to your high school, go to the information session and go there. And then here's another thing, ask great questions. Sometimes colleges do other things like, Elon University, I'm going to say something about them a little later. They have their little coffee get-togethers, and they have found a really high correlation by people that attend one of their like coffee chats and who end up enrolling. Then you've got opening of emails. You also have a lot of colleges will build tests into their application to see who's interested. So what are some of those tests? Optional interview, optional additional essay. Like these are often tests that are designed. Even something like going onto the website and filling out the basic information, that takes you, down the admission funnel. Admissions has something called the admissions funnel, and it's just similar to a sales funnel, right? So it starts out with like, some people call them suspects and then prospects. And those are any potential student out there at all in the world that could attend the school. But then when you've taken one step of initiative toward the school, you move from a prospect or suspect to an inquiry. And that's where the biggest drop off is. Like school might buy 500,000 names from like the College Board through Student Search or the ACC or Niche or someone, and they'll use that as their funnel to start targeting you with tons and tons of emails and direct mail. But normally there's a big drop off from maybe that 500,000 down to maybe, depending on the school, 60 or 80,000 that take one step toward them. So just filling out request informations on the website. And then here's a big one, and I'll come back to this again later. But most people have had the experience of going into Amazon, fooling around, considering buying something, but then you don't buy it and you go somewhere else and then you find that that item pops back up. Has that ever happened to
Yeah.
you, Peg?
Oh, yeah, constantly. Oh, yeah.
Well, I'll just have the exact same abilities. Your entire web traffic, your footprint is tracked. And so that's a big one. In fact, I'll tell you a really cool story. I was talking to a friend of mine who's an admission officer who works at a school where they have this very strong anti-racism initiative. It's all the way to the board level, like something. It's like one of their core values. And they had a student that they were completely undecided about admitting at committee, whether to admit the student or not. And most of the colleges, over 1,900, use something called Slate. It's a CRM that tracks everything. And if you just push a button on Slate, it tracks all your web traffic. So they pulled up this student's web traffic and they noticed that the student had clicked all of these different things, articles and, discussions and speeches on their anti-racism initiative. And they decided to admit the student because they said that the student was aligned with their mission and it showed a high level of engagement and had a good chance of coming. So
Yep.
that's one that's a lot of people don't realize is your amount of web traffic and your amount of engagement. Obviously, apply an early decision. That's the ultimate one. That's the most powerful one. That's the
Would
best.
you say early
Mhm.
action is too, even though it's not binding?
So this is interesting. For some schools, yes, and for others, no. Some schools will tell you we have a higher admit rate with early action because it's a more serious applicant who's been thinking about us over a longer period of time. But I was talking to somebody we interviewed on our podcast recently who said they have a lower yield with early action than they do over regular. So early action, normally it's a little, but infinitesimal. It's more of a limited. And there's another really, really big one. And that is these colleges that have these custom prompts. Most people call them writing supplements. I like to call them custom prompts because they oftentimes are more dispositive in terms of impacting decisions more than the personal statement. And so I kind of like to give them their respect and I call them custom prompts. It sort of venerates them a little bit. But these are these additional questions that they have you write. These paragraph style could be 100 words, could be 800 words. Most are usually in that 200 to 400 word level. I've already mentioned, do you do the optional interview? Do you do the optional prompt? But a really big one is how well do you answer the prompt? In fact, you'll oftentimes get the famous why us question. And that why us question, it's such a popular question because it tests two things. DI, demonstrated interest, likelihood of enrolling, and then DU, which is demonstrated understanding. And that is, do you get who we are? Have you made a compelling case that you're a fit and a match for who we are? So that's a popular question because it can test both DI, because by your answer, they can tell how much research you've done on the school. The more research, you're more serious about them. And have you made a compelling case that you're a fit for our culture? So how well you answer the custom prompts is another really big way.
Yeah,
Oh, and as
yeah,
far
and
as the
I'll just
tracking, I'm sorry.
yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah. So as far as the tracking, like all of the events can be tracked, right? Like, did you come to campus? Did you sign up for anything online? That's all just going to be tracked. When you go buy a fair or a school visit, that's all tracked. In fact, some admission officers will literally tell students when they come by a fair, like, make sure you fill out the inquiry card so you can get credit for it. And they'll do the
Yeah,
same thing like on a school visit too. They'll pass out these little cards. Nowadays, it's getting more sophisticated. There's more scanners at the more expensive fairs or the fairs with the higher budgets. But all that stuff is tracked. And then the online stuff is tracked by your IP addresses.
yeah, yeah. So it's super easy to track. And I'll just double down just
Mhm.
with a personal story. And I always tell our audience, and you mentioned it, like before COVID, I mean, my kids were in a public high school, big public high school. Colleges were constantly coming, and the kids just have to get out of class and go. And I would say, go, show up a little early, think about what you're wearing to school that day so it's appropriate, and then go up, say hi, shake the person's hand, ask a question, like make an impression, because the admission reps that are regionally focused, and you know more about this than I do, but sometimes in the process, they could be the first read or they could be part of a committee. And I know for a fact, like my kids, I did this with my kids, it was Lehigh, and they personally knew this woman from going to the deal. They signed up for the quote unquote optional interview. In my opinion, none of that's optional. You should be doing it. And she got to know them. They, again, dressed appropriate. I was watching all the kids walk into these interviews, and some of them look like they just got off the ladder painting their house. And I was like, that's not a good way for this kid to show up at this interview. But anyways, and this woman walked out of my kids' interviews and said, because they weren't even driving at that point, and she said, your kids should both apply. My daughter got into Lee. She didn't really have on paper. She wasn't in the stat level to even get in, but I think there was a personal part. She didn't go there, but it was a personal part of her application. And this woman was impressed with her. So this is a real thing. And these are things, it's also good for your kids to learn how to, I mean, in the day and age of we're all texting and never talking to each other anymore, they need to build that skill set anyways, right? And get used to that. But I just wanted to double down on exactly what you said. In my family, it was huge. I think it really impacted the situation.
I know it did because first of all, you picked a great school because Lehigh is very, very explicit that they love demonstrated interest. But you also reminded me of another way that I never shared. For some schools, anytime you email like the territory manager, the regional admission officer, that goes into your file. And Lehigh is one. They make that really clear. Like if you can have ongoing communication, with good questions, that goes right into your file. And that is going to be something that can factor into their projection of your likelihood of coming.
Yeah, and I think neither one of us are advocating for what you said earlier, being a stalker and just like sending questions that you don't care about every day just to have a tick, just so they know, oh, that's Peg again, that's Peg again. But talking to a professor, doing these kind of things, that's good for you to understand if it's a good fit for you and to get excited about it and to be able to answer why us question that much better. So demonstrating interest in a school you might be interested in, it's good for the school to track that, because that might help your child get in, but it's also good for your child because they're learning about the school to maybe even decide, no, this is my number 5 school and not my number 1 school for whatever reason. So it's not just an exercise in futility is my point. It's helpful to you as a parent. I mean, I called schools for different things, and if I got certain responses, I was like, I don't even want to give them my money. I don't like the way they're treating me, So it's all good data for the student and the parents, when they're making the decision. So we could do a whole podcast on my next question, and you've already kind of touched on this, but we can just kind of wrap it up in a bow. So why does all this matter to the colleges exactly?
So I've actually saved a lot of new content for this one. So there's 3 reasons why it matters. One of them is, and I like to say this to families, would you admit that sometimes it's hard to kind of know what your 17 or 18-year-old will say or do? And everybody like nods like emphatically, right? And they said, well, what if your job depended on predicting the behavior of like 5,000 18-year-olds? That's not very easy, right?
No.
So one of the reasons why it matters is because you have to get the number right in admissions. Like if you under enroll, you often get fired because in many cases, more than 90% of the budget depends on you. Colleges call it bringing in the class. Did you get your class? Filling in the class, whatever that enrollment number target is. There's like an overall number for getting the right number of heads and beds, but there's also net tuition revenue numbers. So you got to get that number right. So you can't under enroll because now there's a budget shortfall, but then you also can't over enroll. And that happens a lot. Like I remember, UC Irvine, they had a big over enrollment one year. It was close to 1,100. I interviewed Greg Roberts in 2019. He's the chief enrollment officer at UVA. They had just over enrolled 4%. And he's like, I got to get it together. He said it right on the podcast. He said, I'm literally bringing a data scientist into our office to try to help me to get these projections right. So one of the reasons is that you kind of have to get that number right, and there's big consequences for under enrolling and over enrolling. There's colleges that have had to put kids in, in hotels. They've had to, at the last minute, convert doubles to triples and send kids instantly. How about $3,000 if you start in the spring? They don't get enough takers. How about
Yeah.
$7,000? Oh, because we've over enrolled. I remember in New Orleans when you're there putting people on boats and I mean all kinds of different things. Tampa had big
Yeah.
problems. So you can't overroll, underroll. You got to get the number right, and it's really hard to do it. And so having some sense of who's coming is going to make it a lot easier for you to do the projection. So that's one reason. Another reason, I was having a conversation with a school in Ohio about why they like demonstrated interest. And he's like, look, there's limited resources. So we like to do a phone-a-thon, but we can't call every single person in our inquiry pool. So we have the students call the people that have had some engagement with us because they're the ones who have shown they're more serious about us. And they say same thing. They said, we like to send out these like old school, like 4-color, what they used to do in the past, course catalogs with all of that stuff. Now it's all online. But we don't have the budget for the postage and production to do that to everybody. So we like to target people who have had engagement so it can help a college know where to spend their resources. And then probably the most common reason you'll hear, and it's very important. I was on another podcast recently as a guest last week, and it was on rankings and the importance of rankings. And went into did a real deep dive on rankings and how people use rankings. And then one thing I said is my experience, people use admit rates even more than they're using rankings these days. Oh, colleges know that if their admit rate is too high, there's going to be a lot of people that will not even consider their school. They'll look at it like, well, if you're admitting anybody, how good could you be? Or they won't feel proud to wear the t-shirt. And I experienced this when I was in admissions. Like I was doing on a reception in Washington, D.C. I think our admit rate at the time might have been, I don't know, maybe like high 50s, might have been around 60. And 3 different people at that reception asked me, what is your admit rate? And I could tell every time they asked me, it was in the context like, is it good enough for me to think your school is good? Is it good enough for me to be proud enough to send my kid to your school? And I literally came back from that saying, we got to get a lower admit rate because I can't even get some of these families to consider us. So colleges are very mindful of the fact that if their admit rate is too high, there'll be a bunch of people that will not even consider their school. And also, if their admit rate is lower, it will impact yield. And yield is just the percentage of people that say yes to your offers. The schools that have, lower admit rates have higher yields. It's just a fact. And so what this practically means if you're in admissions is you don't want to blow your admit rate up for a kid that has almost no chance of coming because one, you don't get the kid. And then secondly, you made it harder to get the next kid.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was at a SACAC conference, and they said this publicly, so I'll say it as well. Rhodes College again in Memphis. They said, we can look at our data, and there's a certain applicant that has a less than 1% chance of coming. So why should we send an admit rate? Or a quote from High Point in North Carolina, if you ghost us, we'll ghost you right back. So the idea being we are going to make it so much harder for ourselves to get the kids that we want to come if our admit rate is too high. So why should we waste a high admit rate on people that have shown no indications that they're coming? So that's another reason. It make it a lot harder helping you to get some of the kids that you want to get in order to fill your class.
Yeah. 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 I mean, and I'm sure people's heads are spinning a little bit, but the way you're explaining this is so well done that it hopefully this is starting to land for people, and not that you can figure all of this out. But I think it's super helpful just to know the world you're living in when you have these high school, college-bound kids. I mean, this is the sandbox that you're playing in, and you don't have to own all of this, but it's important. It's important to understand it. So you kind of hinted to this before. So not all colleges, just like everything in this world, not all colleges do things exactly the same. Not all of them care about this. So since they don't, you said at the beginning with the Swarthmore example, like everybody cares at a certain amount. But if people are listening and going, well, so I know there's a common data set and they rank it. So if somebody's like, oh, I'm not going to go look that up. He's lost me. I don't want to do it. Like, are there any, and if there are any stereotypes, and maybe there are generalizations, maybe there aren't, but if there are there ways to kind of look at a school and something you would normally look at and go, yeah, they probably care about demonstrated interest, or this one might not, that kind of
Sure.
thing?
So once again, going to the common data set is going to be the most accurate way to at least know. I would say if you do that, if they even say considered, you should you should take that seriously because I do find sometimes in there's some schools I know that use demonstrate an interest to the nth degree and they'll just label it considered or important. I'm like, it's very important for you. And I was having a conversation with one and they said, well, the only things that we class is very important are grades and rigor. So anything else is not going to be in that category. So there's some subjectivity in the classification. But let me get into some general stereotypes, but these are stereotypes you do have to be careful. So in general, private schools do it more than public. Large publics are oftentimes the ones that don't do it. You talk to Georgia Tech and they'll say, the only way we look at demonstrated interest is did you apply or did you not apply? Apply. That's it. That's it. Did you apply? Did you not apply? UCLA will tell you the exact same thing. And these are all people I've had on my podcast, and they said it on the podcast. We have on our podcast one of our co-hosts, Kate Strickland, is she's over application reading for Colorado Boulder, CU Boulder, and when we start talking about this stuff, she's like, I don't even know what you're talking about because we don't do any of that stuff. So you'll find your bigger flagships normally don't, but then again, there's exceptions because Michigan did, and Michigan has done it for a long time. I don't have time to get into all the reasons why I know they did it, but I wasn't surprised at all when they were one of the few schools to come out and add early decision. And there is a trend line more toward public starting to do it more. So, in one general stereotype would be privates do it more than public, and the other stereotype would be less selective schools do it more than more selective schools. So, I'll give you another story. I was talking with Andy. Once again, he's one of our co hosts. He's over Connecticut College's admission office. And I asked him, Andy, what percentage of colleges do you feel are literally tracking your web traffic? Because we had a former admission officer from Drew in New Jersey come on our podcast, and he said every single day he got a printout of everybody in his territory and to see what their web traffic was, to see if they'd been on the website and where they went every day. And I was asking, how common is that? And he said, well, it's not very common, but sort of at the Drew College level of selectivity, it's quite common. So once again, if you want to look for a tip, look at a school's yield. If you see yield, and this is a published statistic that you can look up, percentage of people that say yes to your offer. Anytime you see yield rates like under 20%, under 30%, private school, high probability they're going to be doing it. So those would be some stereotypes. Public versus private, more selective versus less selective.
Yeah.
Now, more selective schools do it, but for more selective schools, it's normally did you apply ED? Or if you're one of the 7 selective schools that doesn't have ED, but you have some version of restrictive early action. So I'm talking about Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, Caltech, and then Notre Dame and Georgetown. They have a slightly different version, but they also have some version of restricted. With Notre Dame and Georgetown, you can't apply ED if you apply EA. To the other ones, you can't apply to any other private EA. You know, for those more selective schools, it's normally did you apply through our early process, even if it's non-binding or binding for an ED school, and how well did you answer those custom prompts? You
Yeah.
know, those
Yeah.
those are the main ways. And then I would say, did you at least virtually visit? There's at least some, because colleges have a term called stealth applicant or ghost applicant, and it's literally somebody like we don't even know where the this person even came from. They're nowhere in our database. That's
Yeah.
usually not good. But I've talked to schools who say if you've just had one point of contact with us, it could be you sent us an email, you came to a fair, you filled out an inquiry form, then we're not going to put you in that category of zero engagement.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and these selective schools, they highly compete with each other. So even
Correct.
though they're selective, they're still competing. I mean, we see that all the time on the financial side that you can bounce them off each other and they'll play ball all day to
Yes. And it's a
match their
myth.
competitors.
It's
Yeah.
a myth to think that they don't care about this stuff because if you're getting, I mean, I could keep you all day up with stories, but I used to work at, KIPP, the nation's largest charter school network, and we had a partnership with Duke, and they would bring in our highest achievers for 4 days way early in the year. And then they would offer them a spot, but only if it was ED. So even for these most selective schools, if you're getting into Duke, you might be getting into Princeton or into Yale or Northwestern or Penn. And so they still have some fierce competition, which is why they still tend to have a pretty big differential between their early decision admit rate and their regular decision admit rate. But you have to be careful saying So publics don't do it because, for example, William and Mary, they're really into demonstrated interest. Same for Miami of Ohio. So there are exceptions, but in general, public, private, more selective, less selective, that there's definitely truth to that.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So to wrap this up, what are there any, key takeaways? And if you want to break it down, parent key takeaways and student, or just key takeaways for both, that would be great.
But one of the key takeaways, Peg, is what you mentioned earlier. You talked about like you kind of should be researching your schools. You should be visiting if possible, if not virtually, and spending time on their website. So the best way to think about it is if you just naturally put in a lot of research into the schools on your list, you will automatically be demonstrating interest. And it will be the byproduct of the research that you put in to get to know the school. And people should be researching. There's one level of research. Do I want to apply? And then, okay, if they decision to apply, but then let's say you got into 6 schools and it's not practical to go to the admitted student visit program for all of them. Maybe you could only go to 2 or 3. Then you're trying to figure out, okay, which ones would I actually go back and do an admitted student visit program? So you're researching all the way until you make your deposit. So that would be the first thing that I would say is, have you applied? And then I'm going to put a little bit of a shameless plug in, but I did 2 really in depth interviews if somebody wants more information on this. I did an interview with Matt Bonser, who's over Colorado College. And what I did with him is we went through 17 different ways that the public thinks you demonstrate interest, and he rated them from 0 to 10. And then, so that's interview 152. And then interview 235 is with Greg Zeiser, who's the chief enrollment officer at Elon. And he did an interview on why demonstrated interest is so important to them and how they track it. So if anybody's interested in that, if you just put in your college bound kid interview 152 or interview 235, you could get like kind of an hour deep dive and go into
Yeah, that's great.
more things than we covered here. The one thing that came out in that Matt Bonser interview too is athletics also is a thing, right? Like if it's a recruited athlete that who's had engagement with the coach, that tends to be something where there's going to be a higher yield, and so that counts. As one of the ways and that's obviously not going to apply to everybody, but it's something worth noting.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed that even like D3 schools, a
Oh
lot of
yeah.
times the coach really wants the kid. They're going to walk that, not literally because it's electronically done, but they're going to show up in Office of Admissions and say, I want this kid to play, yada, yada. So I always tell parents, play the cards you have, whatever cards you have, play them. But I think I love that you put that as a key takeaway because I always try and tell parents, take a deep breath. It's all going to be fine. Your kid's going to end up where they belong. And to your point, this is a massive investment. Like you and your kids, and especially your kids, should be showing some initiative and doing a lot of this stuff that falls under the DI category. So you should be doing it anyways to make a good decision. And to your point, my daughter applied to like 10 schools and she got into all of them. And we sat at the dining room table and I'm like, all right, this school, she ended up at JMU, which I love that school. It's like wonderful atmosphere there. She loved it, had visited, my husband and I visited because they went with my parents, and I said, "We're spending all this money. We gotta go on this campus." And I just fell in love with it. And I was like, I'm not gonna mention the other schools because there's nothing wrong with them, but it was just like,
Mhm.
it's harder to get to, it's way more expensive. There's no way we can appeal to get it close to JMU. Why would I even take you there? At that point, there's no point in just visiting 10 schools just for the hell of it, right? So I think that's a great way to end this is you should be doing this stuff that then you can check the box. I've demonstrated interest because that's the way you make a good sound decision anyways, to pick a school that's going to be great for your kid and they're going to be happy to call it home for 4 years and have that great chapter, and then hopefully they go off and they either go to grad school or they get employed and you're not paying their bills anymore. That's the whole goal here, right? So demonstrating interest, if you demonstrate no interest at a school, you're probably just throwing a dart at the wall, in my opinion. So
There's also a correlation with money too, because a lot of schools, this, but you're the money people, right? Some schools do preferential packaging, like the people they want more, they get better packages too. And one of the things that can make a school wants you more is to really legitimately feel like they're in the game with you. So
Yeah.
in some
Yeah.
cases, it can result in a better, not all, but some cases it can result in a better package.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, Mark, this was great. I knew it was going to be great. I learned. I always learn when we have people on the podcast. So thank you for being here. And he mentioned it a few times. It's not a shameless plug. It's a wonderful plug. Like, go to Your College Bound Kid. So much information. You can spend hours and hours and pick the stuff that's of interest to you. And obviously he has great people on and you are so knowledgeable. So thank you for being here. It was a great conversation that I know hugely benefited everybody that's listening and all of our listeners. I know you found this valuable. Share what we're doing here. And we're happy to show up in everybody's living room, if you will, like they used to say. If we can help, we can support you in this process. We're more than happy to do it. So again, Mark, any parting words before we sign off here?
A couple of things. One is, first of all, it's a lot of fun. I'm a junkie for this stuff, so I love this. It was a lot of fun. And thank you for all you do. So we use CAP with all of our students. And I just read an email last night from someone going on and on and on about how helpful it is and how glad they were that, we introduced them to CAP. So keep up the great work you're doing just to help families, empower families with knowledge so that they can find the best fits and matches for them from a budget standpoint. And I really admire the work that you do and want you to just keep doing what you're doing, Peg, and
Oh,
Matt and the
thank
whole
you.
team.
Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you. Love to hear that. So, all right, everybody, we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you like what you heard, please follow us, share our show, and maybe even send it to a parent or counselor who would enjoy it. I'm your host, Peg Keogh, and I was joined by our special guest, Mark Stucker, who's the producer of an amazing podcast called Your College Bound Kid. This episode was produced by the amazing Eileen Campbell. We'll see you back here next week.